General Motors is still recruiting at Factory Zero in Detroit. The company describes the place as its Detroit Hamtramck electric vehicle facility with battery assembly beside the vehicle plant. On the current careers page, it is a working industrial site with a factory name that belongs to the present tense, but the ground under that name was assembled from a 465-acre section of Poletown. Detroit and Hamtramck cleared it for GM. The documented count is roughly 1,400 to 1,500 homes, 144 businesses, and 16 churches. So the question is not whether a factory appeared, it did. The question is how a promise of jobs became enough to take a living piece of a city and hand the land to a private manufacturer. There is an important correction before the story gets any louder. Detroit did not erase all of Poletown. The federal record describes the project area as a 465-acre section within the larger community, containing about 13% of Poletown's 1980 population. That distinction matters. It is the difference between a slogan and a map. The map is still devastating. Poletown was not a vacant tract waiting for a use. It was a neighborhood of homes, storefronts, churches, and streets on the Detroit-Hamtramck line. The archive from the clearance years holds photographs of residents, businesses, interiors, street life, and people loading belongings into moving trucks. Those pictures do not need a narrator to invent a final holdout or a bulldozer at somebody's front door. The record gives us something more solid. A place full enough to leave a visual trail when it was broken apart. In late 1980, Detroit and Hamtramck created the Central Industrial Park joint venture to acquire and prepare land for a GM assembly plant. The public case was plain. Detroit was under economic pressure. A new automobile plant meant industrial work, tax revenue, and a chance to hold on to part of the city's manufacturing future. That argument was not made of thin air. The project drew federal money for acquisition, relocation, and site preparation, $138 million in those categories. GM was not asking for a ceremonial ribbon cutting on an empty field. It needed a large assembled site. The cities were prepared to provide one. That last phrase is the machinery of the story, an assembled site. A factory can be designed on a drawing. A site has to be made in the city that already exists. It has boundaries, titles, tenants, streets, buildings, and institutions. Before the first production line could run, somebody had to decide that all of those things inside this particular line could be converted into industrial ground. The money also matters for its direction. Federal funds helped acquire property, relocate residents and businesses, and prepare the site. This was not simply GM buying land from willing sellers one parcel at a time. Public power and public money were part of the exchange from the start. The promised return was public as well: work, revenue, and a future for an industrial city under pressure. That is why Poletown cannot be reduced to a quarrel between a corporation and a few holdouts. The cities were making a civic argument. The residents were living with its terms. The uncomfortable question was built into the arrangement long before the demolition. When a government promises a benefit to everyone, who gets to decide which people must make room for it? This is where a map can make a hard decision look clean. A line is drawn around 465 acres. Parcels appear inside it. A plant appears at the end of the process. On paper, the future becomes a boundary. On the ground, the boundary had owners, tenants, congregations, customers, routines, and addresses. The later court record shows that the project did not move forward in a silent room. There were public scoping sessions. More than 100 people attended one of them in August 1980. Maps were proposed that would not relocate people south of East Grand Boulevard. 9 site alternatives were analyzed. The Poletown Neighborhood Council formed and met regularly. Those facts do not prove that one alternative would certainly have saved the neighborhood. the record cannot honestly promise that. But they do establish something just as important. This was not weather. It was a public choice with maps, meetings, objections, and a deadline for acquiring title to the GM site. Procedure can make a decision visible. It cannot by itself make the decision harmless. The process also had a pace. The federal court record describes pressure to get title to the parcels for GM. A historical account of the project notes that Michigan's revised condemnation procedure allowed demolition to proceed before court challenges were settled. That does not prove that every legal safeguard was meaningless, and it does not tell us what every official believed. It tells us that the argument over the neighborhood was taking place, while the physical possibility of preserving it was shrinking. There is a particular cruelty in that kind of calendar, not secret cruelty, not a conspiracy that needs to be invented, just the ordinary force of an acquisition schedule. Each title obtained makes the project more real and makes the old map harder to defend. By the time a public argument reaches its cleanest legal language, the street it concerns may already be coming apart. The people in Poletown were not all doing the same thing, and the story gets worse when it pretends they were. Some accepted the city's offers, some joined a neighborhood council, some challenged the taking in court. What the record preserves most sharply is a collective act at Immaculate Conception Church. Protesters held a sit-in there for 29 days. The church stood in the clearance area and was scheduled for demolition. The protesters were removed. Demolition followed 2 days later. That is the scene. A church, a sustained occupation, removal, demolition. No discovered transcript gives us the last speech. No source in this record lets us place a specific resident in a particular house when the machines arrived, so there is no need to manufacture either. The fact that a community had to occupy one of its own institutions for 29 days tells us what the city's timetable had begun to demand. Buildings in North Poletown started coming down in the spring of 1981. The Harkness photographs made through that year show what a clearance looks like when it is not yet an abstraction. Houses and businesses, people and their possessions, then demolished buildings and the altered street. The photographs are useful precisely because they do not claim to be a verdict. They do not tell us what every person thought about moving. They do not turn a family into a symbol. They preserve the ordinary scale that a redevelopment map removes. A business front, a home interior, a truck being loaded, a street that had a name before it became part of a project area. The archive leaves the residents visible without forcing them into a single invented story. It is tempting to make that the whole verdict. A neighborhood was cleared. The verdict writes itself. But the federal review of the project makes the easy version of the story incomplete. 90% of property owners accepted the offers. In surveys after relocation, many residents said they liked their new homes or felt positive about the move. At the same time, residents repeatedly said they missed neighbors, friends, and their church. A better house can be a better house. It still cannot reproduce the people across the street, the familiar shop, or the parish that gave the address its shape. That is not a claim that every move was a personal disaster. The evidence does not permit it. It is a different and more stubborn point. A relocation program can measure property, payments, and satisfaction with a new home. It has a much harder time measuring the disappearance of a social world. The acceptance figure should not be mistaken for a referendum on whether the neighborhood was expendable. It records that owners accepted the offers. The surveys record that many people found advantages in their new housing. Those are facts worth keeping in the frame. They stop the story from turning displaced residents into a single chorus. But acceptance of an offer and happiness with a newer house answer different questions from the one raised by a vanished neighborhood. The GAO's own record makes that gap visible. People could report better conditions at home and still say they missed their neighbors, friends, and church. There is no contradiction in that. A relocation payment can replace a building. It cannot purchase the exact web of recognition that made a block feel inhabited. That is not nostalgia added after the fact. It is the loss residents themselves reported in the survey record. The project's defenders did not have to pretend the plant would be imaginary. GM began production at Detroit Hamtramck in February 1985. When the Government Accountability Office looked at the site in June 1989, it counted 3,554 employees. That is a number with weight. It means the story cannot honestly end with an empty lot and a broken promise about jobs. The plant produced work. It gave the public rationale something real to point toward. But the same federal snapshot recorded only 59 employees living in Poletown or nearby. That is not a lifetime census of who benefited. It does not prove that former residents were excluded from every opportunity or that all the jobs were meant for them alone. It does show how narrow the nearby connection looked 4 years after production began. This is the point where the arithmetic becomes morally tempting and historically dangerous. It would be easy to put the homes on one side of a page, the workers on the other, and declare a winner. The record will not bear that. It does not provide a complete lifetime tally of promised jobs against delivered jobs. And it does not let us calculate the value of a neighborhood as if every church, shop, and friendship had one fixed price. What it does provide is a more exact discomfort. The industrial future arrived in a form substantial enough to employ thousands. Yet the available 1989 count shows only a small number of workers living in or near the place whose land had been cleared. A benefit can be genuine and still travel elsewhere. That is a very different conclusion from saying it never existed. The difference matters because the original bargain had been made in the name of a public future. Land, relocation, and demolition went in one direction. Jobs and tax base were supposed to come back in another. The accounting was never as simple as homes versus no homes or jobs versus no jobs. The factory was real. The losses were real. The difficult question was whether the first fact could settle the second. For a time, Michigan law gave the public side of that bargain a very broad answer. The 1981 Poletown decision had treated an expected economic benefit from a private enterprise as enough to support the use of eminent domain in that setting. Then, in 2004, the Michigan Supreme Court revisited that reasoning in a different condemnation case, County of Wayne versus Hathcock. The court overruled Poletown's economic benefit analysis. It rejected the idea that generalized economic benefit by itself could carry the constitutional argument for such private transfers. Hathcock was not a time machine. It concerned another proposed taking and a legal standard, not a way to reopen 1981. The court did not issue compensation for a whole neighborhood in the opinion, and it did not order a factory dismantled. Its power was narrower and, in another sense, more revealing. It said the rationale that had made the earlier bargain seem legally sufficient could no longer do that work. The ruling did not put Poletown back. Courts can change a rule. They cannot rebuild the blocks already cleared beneath it. It did not erase the GM plant or deny that it employed people. What it changed was the standard by which the old defense had been made. That is what makes Poletown harder to file away as either a simple civic betrayal or a simple industrial success. The plant's existence does not excuse the clearance. The clearance does not make the plant fictional. The later court decision leaves both facts standing, then asks a colder question about the rule that tried to join them. How much public benefit is enough to make someone else's place expendable? The archive cannot answer that for every household. It cannot tell us whether a different site would have worked or turn survey answers into a final judgment on a life after relocation. The record does show the limits of the choices that were offered. It shows a public process, a community that fought within it and against it, an operating plant, and a legal rationale later judged too broad. That is more than a story about buildings removed for a factory. It is a story about the language of a shared future. The words jobs, recovery, and tax base are not false words. They can describe real needs, but they can also decide very specifically whose street becomes the payment. Factory Zero now stands on the old Detroit Hamtramck site, and GM's careers page still lists Detroit roles there. That is all the current record needs to say. It does not establish today's output, workforce, or financial health. It establishes that the industrial residue remains active enough to hire. Beside that present tense trace sits a different kind of record, a project boundary on a federal map, and black and white photographs of homes, businesses, residents, and moving trucks from 1981. One record shows what was built. The other shows what had to disappear for the building to have room. The job listing is not a lie. Neither are the photographs. Between them is the part of Poletown that no later ruling could restore.